Greeting, fellow students of World Civilizations, and welcome to the first of our summary and review videos that we'll be posting for Core 140 this semester. The purpose behind these videos is exactly what the title implies, summary and review, to go back over some of the essential concepts and ideas that we've talked about over the course of the semester so far, and help you sort of put them into perspective and set them against the backdrop of the things we'll be continuing to do throughout the course of the semester. As you can see, I'm hanging out in ancient Egypt, at least in regard to my Zoom background. I'm hanging out in ancient Egypt. Looking forward to the day very much when I can actually jump on a plane again and actually fly to some of these places. But until then, we'll just use our imaginations. And in fact, the imagination should not be underrated or overlooked as a means for journeying to the past, enjoying tremendous exotic places, or for learning and stretching ourselves. We've been using our imaginations over the course of the semester so far to go back to the very beginnings of human civilizations, to look at the first emergence of complex societies. We started out talking about the Paleolithic period, a time when people operated in primarily a hunter-gatherer mode, traveling in small groups. And then we moved to talk about the Neolithic Revolution, that period in human history when people began to plant and cultivate their own crops. They began to care for herds and flocks instead of traveling to find the animals. And because of that, they were able to locate themselves alongside bodies of water and build complex stratified societies. When this happens, we can say that human civilizations have begun to arise due to the fact that they're raising surplus capital. Because they're able to raise more than they need to provide the essential needs of the community, now certain people are free to specialize, whereas before, everyone had to be involved in the task of hunting and gathering in order to enable the community to survive. Now, you've got a situation where certain people can specialize in other things. They can invest themselves in the study of law, in governance, in the cultivating of religious systems, while others continue to do the work of providing for the sustenance of the overall community. We talked about a number of very early settlements like Shatalyuk in modern-day Turkey, or Jericho, which is on the edge of modern-day Palestine. And then we moved to talking about some collective societies that were located near one another. The ones we talked about the most early on were those located in the ancient Near East, in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia, as it was called by Herodotus, the famous early Greek historian. There are other societies, as we indicated, that probably had extensive populations, just like those of the ancient Near East, that had their own beliefs and had their own worldviews and their own cultural peculiarities. But the reason why we focus so much on the ancient Near East is because they developed something very early on that some other societies are still challenged to develop, and that is the ability to write, to communicate in written form. We talked about cuneiform tablets and the fact that they are very durable writing material, and because of that, they're going to survive the ravages of the ages. Of course, they're also a very complex writing material and a very complex system of writing as well. They can't be transported very easily. Their durability comes at the cost of their portability. And also the number of characters needed to master cuneiform language is somewhere in the neighborhood of around 1,200 separate characters. They're not a very democratic form of language. In other words, it's a language for specialists. It's a language for those who are capable of spending most of their lives mastering it. Because these peoples developed written communication, they moved from what we often call prehistory, that time when we're mostly dependent on archaeology and on physical remains to give us information about a people group, to history, that period when we have written records. We've got other means, other primary source tools to help us understand what a civilization or civilizations were like. We talked about the ancient Near East, including their system of governance, their religion, and also their great early epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh. We talked about that story, how it connects with other ancient tales of a similar nature. And we talked about what the Epic of Gilgamesh says about the culture and the general predisposition of people in this ancient Near Eastern world, or actually ancient Near Eastern worlds, because they were originally a collection of scattered city-states. Of course, that all changes when Sargon of Akkad in the 24th century BC arises and unites these city-states under his rule. Sargon could be said to be one of the first people that franchised the idea of empire. And after him, there will be a succession of various ancient Near Eastern-based empires, including the Old Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, and then ultimately, arising about 512 and continuing to stay in power until the rise of Alexander the Great in the 330s and 320s, the Persian Empire, which at one time ruled one of the largest land empires in history. We talked about the Egyptians as well and discussed some of the peculiarities of their culture, located along the Nile River Basin, a culture that very much prized this life as well as the life to come, and invested a great deal of treasure and time and effort into the creation of monuments to their kings, to their pharaohs, which would ensure that those pharaohs would survive into the afterlife, that their Ka, their internal essence, would live on in the afterlife in an exalted sort of copy of this imperfect life that we live now. They would live on a higher plane, a greater sort of reality. And in order to ensure that they could do well in that new reality, we talked about how the Egyptians mastered the art of mummification, how they invested incredible amounts of treasure and human toil in the creation of these monuments that today we know as the pyramids, which they created during the Old Kingdom of Egypt's history. We talked about some of those different frames of reference the historians have constructed to better understand the course of Egyptian history, discussing the Archaic period when the Pharaoh Menes united Upper and Lower Egypt, the Old Kingdom period when the Egyptians did invest so much effort in pyramid building and seemed to be so obsessed with the question of what happens in the afterlife, especially for the most powerful among them. We had gotten to the Middle Kingdom period and discussed the fact that Egyptian trade and commerce had expanded exponentially during that era, and had closed our discussion of the Middle Kingdom period by hinting at the arrival of a new people group, a Semitic people group. We noted that Semitic is a linguistic term, not an ethnic term. It refers to certain people groups that spoke languages that were related to one another in the land that at one time was called Canaan, which today we refer to as Palestine. In other words, these are both Hebrew peoples, the people with whom we most associate the term Semitic, and other peoples of the world at that time as well. Groups like the Philistines, the Sea peoples who came over and settled in the east of that area, and many of the other Canaanite tribes that are mentioned in various pieces of literature who lived in that area during the ancient period and who shared some common linguistic roots. The Hyksos, who were a group of Semitic peoples who came in and seemed to have destabilized Egypt during the end of the Middle Kingdom period, attracted our attention towards the end of that discussion, and we speculated a little bit where they came from, what their influence might be, and we'll continue to talk about that as we come back together at the end of the week. If you're trying to get a handle on what we're doing here as we're exploring these various cultures, one thing I can suggest is that you look at our conversations about them through the lens of three important facets of each culture. If you've noticed by now, what I tend to do is to try to look at each culture's political system and social organization. One, the political system and social organization. Two, what was their worldview or their perspective on ultimate things? In other words, to make it simple for us today, what was their religious perspective? Now, we have to qualify that because a people's perspective on ultimate things is not always a religious perspective per se, especially in contemporary times. But in those times, in the ancient world, most often it was. Most often they did believe in mystical forces, gods and goddesses behind nature that influenced things and impacted the way that they lived their lives and the prospects they had for a better future. So what was their political and social system? Two, what were their religious views and how did that influence the development of their cultures? Three, you've probably already noticed, we always talk about their role in the development of written communication. And the reason for that is because that is so central, so crucial to understanding who these people were, to understanding their perspectives, for giving us any information whatsoever about the nature of their civilizations and the worlds in which they lived. And so definitely you will notice, you have noticed, I'm sure, and you will continue to notice that with each one of these societies early in the semester, we are going to emphasize their contribution to the development of written communication in both the ancient world and extending down to the present day. We have inherited the ability to create complex linguistic systems and writing because of the pioneering efforts of some of these ancient peoples. And so look for those things as we're going forward. In fact, as you're preparing to answer essay questions, one important thing you might do is group the specific things that we talk about, the specific data that I give you or we discuss in regard to these ancient civilizations under those categories: social organization, political structure, the worldview or religious orientation of each particular civilization, and finally, their contribution to written communication. How did they communicate with one another, and how did they, by forging systems of written communication, help to lay the foundations for future systems to come, even further developments in the art of written communication in world civilizations? Those three aspects will give you a way to group some of the more general information that we're discussing and help you to identify the most important elements of each society that we are tending to foreground in the course of our conversations. We're going to continue these discussions when we come back together at the end of the week on Friday by looking at the ancient Egyptians at the end of the Middle Kingdom period and the New Kingdom period. We'll then switch gears and talk about the Hebrews and some of the other smaller people groups of the ancient world. And we'll then turn our focus to the Greeks, who dominate so much of the discourse during the ancient period. We'll look at many of the elements they laid, foundational elements they laid, on which later civilizations are going to be building, including our own. Hope you have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you soon.